illustration to my left on page 90 is Samara ivory from the 2nd millennium BCE, and it's a really, really beautiful, really simple pared down version of the volutes, which you're going to recognize in the Ionic and Corinthian orders of Greek columns. And then in the middle, you've got this kind of pointed triangle. So it's not a perfect triangle, but it's sort of pointed upwards, which could certainly indicate any number of different planes of existence, or simply, I guess, symbolically, the palmette, which we're going to find reduced into that sort of central crown position in the Corinthian order, is sometimes also just a triangle. The following illustration of the pot, which was referred to in Cyprus, is captioned 2nd to 1st millennium BCE, Cyprian. The sacred tree is transformed to the point of no longer offering anything explicitly vegetal after Ibid Dantin. And yeah, I mean, here you've got it's really become kind of figurative. We don't even necessarily get the sense of a spiral, because the line actually sort of folds back in on itself, which you often see in the Ionic order. So it's kind of very illustrative, you could say, and sort of repeats this loose line. To the left and to the right are again, let's say, creatures of nature. There seem to be antelope. To the right we have the caption Pharaoh head from ancient Egypt, after Systematischer Bilderatlas zum Konversationslexikon ikonographischer Enzyklopädie der Wissenschaften und Kunst. The translation is basically that it's a encyclopedia of iconographic knowledge and art from, well, Egypt, and I'm sure lots of other eras. That was published in 1875, that lexicon. The image is a pharaoh as described, and I guess the reason why this is important is that you have either a sort of a snake or maybe a bird emerging from the central crown position, which is where you're going to find a lot of very sacred aspects to all of this, because of course this is your third eye, pineal gland, frontal cortex activation zone, which is used in meditation to access other realms of reality. Back to the text. Apparently, it was Jesus Christ himself who said, quote, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people." I'm going to just return for a minute to page 91, because I've simply continued reading after the image and jumped forward a little bit, so please excuse. What is also increasingly central to these motifs, from which range from the supporting columns with vegetal crowns or capitals to the ceramic work featured above, is the importance of a triangular or crescent or floral or shell-shaped object in the top middle of the design. With multiple variations right across the genealogy of sacred plant motifs, it appears that this must be a reference to the third eye that is activated by the pineal gland in deep meditation, and which has been so famously venerated by ancient cultures around the world, as well as numerous groups wishing to align themselves with such powers thereafter. An important detail which resurfaces in the top middle, quote, third eye position of the architectural design of the Corinthian column is a small worm. Okay, I'm going to go off-piste a little bit here, and I know it's been really bumpy today, but I think it's significant before I get into all this worm and phoenix business that this imagery of the third eye, this, classic like Illuminati, dollar, provocation, seems, in my research, much more likely to be indicating the existence of the consciousness behind the eye, rather than the surveying quality of power across, the lower regions of the triangle, which I think is like a very convenient way in which power sort of uses that. But I think actually there's something much more interesting going on there, which is about the nature of consciousness and about how consciousness exists in time. And again, I think once we start to think of time as something which is concurrent, but also sort of synchronous, so it's like linear and cyclical at the same moment, this starts to convey the idea that you are kind of reliving something that already came before, but you are also shaping the thing that comes after. So another way of describing this is kind of dreamtime healing, which the ancient Aboriginals, where they describe this idea of living 7 lives concurrently, right? So you have 3 lives ahead of you in linear time and 3 lives behind you, but you can also go into your former lives to resolve traumas that are still affecting you in your life today. And actually, if you just think about that from a basic psychological point of view, it's quite a helpful strategy as well, right? Like if you have shame about something, or if you have a kind of recurrent image in your mind, if you're able to kind of dissociate, or not dissociate, that's the worst thing you can do, to actually like distance yourself and sort of give yourself the space to say that, okay, well, that was what I needed at the time, that was something that happened, it has its own kind of lessons to be learned, but I don't have to live with that as my character and my identity for my entire life. This is also helpful even without this sort of mystical stuff that the Dreamtime healers are getting into. Okay, so I'm going to continue now with the text. An important detail which resurfaces in the top middle, quote, third eye, unquote, position of the architectural design of the Corinthian column is a small worm. This worm is said to be strongly tied to the myth of the phoenix. For when the phoenix burns out every 100 or 500 years, this small worm remains in the bird's nest. From this small worm grows the new phoenix. Apparently, it was Jesus Christ himself who said, quote, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people," unquote. Psalm 22, verse 6. Phoenix symbolism is often coupled to the story of Christ, and in true Masonic character, the reference is obscure, as on many columns it is either disguised as a flower or replaced by any number of other sculptural details. They are often only possible to see through a camera with a strong zoom. Where is another famous third eye at the top of a pyramidal form? The dollar. Why are there hidden owls and demons woven into the design of the same side of the dollar bill? Men can be so goddamn creepy. And I suspect that is precisely the point. 2 typologies are identified by Professor Shilo on the island of Cyprus that demonstrate the simulation of earlier forms of palm expression. The central reference to a third eye positionality and a diversity of forms from complex to more simplistic. Until now, I have explicated upon a fairly loose body of forms that are nonetheless consistent in establishing a timeline of the Garden of Paradise or sacred tree of immortality. The tide of replications with variants that flooded the Fertile Crescent and beyond has brought a multitude of intricate and dynamic interpretations on the form. Whether they have been employed as the pillars to a gateway for the god Shamash in Susa, modern-day Iran, in the 3rd millennium, or upon the pots used in offerings to the gods in Cyprus of the 1st millennium BCE, the curved fronds and trunk of the palm tree have weathered the tides of time. This gives me the initial example of what I will name cultural epigenetics, the expression of variation based upon socio-political, material and artistic conditions that nonetheless remains faithful to a specific iconographic symbolic order. Although an enormous range of diversity has been demonstrated, surely a much larger variety of forms has been lost to history. And as the Tree of Life is the religious and mystical symbol par excellence, particularly in the context of the Middle East under discussion, one can only guess at the sheer range of alternative religious imagery that has been sacrificed for the palm to emerge as the dominant form. Footnote 7. Quote, "The Tree of Life Genesis and the Goakera from Persian and Zoroastrian myth both belong to the cycle of legends relating to plants that have the power to confer immortality or even to recall life. This belief also exists in Mesopotamia." Unquote. Ibid Dantin, page 137. Caption to the illustration on page 195. 1646. Church of St. Sulpice, Paris. Corinthian column with phoenix worm. Okay, we've got some more illustrations. This chapter is thick with them. On the left, we've got a zoom photograph that I took of the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. Particularly kind of interesting motif, which is then enlarged beneath the Corinthian capital, which is under investigation, is this exactly this kind of phoenix worm disguised as a floral motif in the architectural detailing. One inevitably feels like you're playing their game when you start getting into all of this stuff. And honestly, I've been so skeptical of all of this for like the last 20 years. But I have to say, I'm starting to get sucked into this idea of deep time and kind of the recurrence of life over and over again as being probably some of the most crucial secret history that this architecture is pointing towards. And I find that to be sort of an emancipatory way of thinking as well, because it means that I'm no longer afraid of what I experience in this lifetime. And also I feel that I'm feeding into a different experience of consciousness in another one. And thus I'm also benefiting from, and in a sense remembering, things that I've learned in a previous incarnation. I find those to be really fascinating ideas. The caption, 17th century, Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin, with floral variation on phoenix worm. Every building that employs classical Greek architecture is riddled with architectural expressions of reincarnation, intentionally or not. And the caption for the two small graphics on the opposing page, 7th to 5th BCE, the Cypriot capitals have mostly been ascribed to the 7th to 5th centuries. In analysing the repertory of patterns appearing on them, two typological groups can be distinguished: simple and complex. So, I mean, as the caption describes, right, to the top of the page you have almost the most abstracted sort of capital with volutes one could imagine, and it has 3 vertical bars above, 1 below, and of course the shape. If you combine 2 spirals moving in opposing directions, you get a triangle shape there in the middle. And then beneath that, it's a little bit more embellished. You have some of these kind of non-complete but spiral-like forms, which we encountered on the pot a few pages previously. And then beneath that, you have some volute action and some triangle action. Again, very, very sort of mesmerizing and beautiful. These destroyed or simply abandoned forms are comparable with background mutations insofar as they occur frequently, but are ultimately jettisoned. These jettisoned or abandoned expressions have been negated by the evolutionary forms which have come to dominate the archaeological record, and therefore, I argue, the imprint of human thought within the historical record of the period. But before leaping to conclusions concerning the epistemology or root of the Garden of Paradise within Judeo-Christian theology, an important deviation 500 years before Christ has been grossly neglected. It is one which reveals more, perhaps, about the performativity of a given archaeological simulacrum, and one that has been employed with greater pervasiveness than even the crucifix of Christ or the McDonald's sign. The following image is a drawing taken from the temple to the Greek god Apollo around 400 BCE. Though the height of Greek culture is posited to have occurred circa 1200 BCE, this latter type of column only came into existence some 800 years later. No one knows exactly where it originated, but the image below is from the very oldest Corinthian column in history. Footnote 8. Quote, "The earliest Corinthian capital for which we have evidence is the example from the Temple of Apollo at Bassae, examined and drawn by Haller von Hallerstein in 1811." Unquote. David Scahill, The Origins of the Corinthian Capital, 2004. I'm going to take this opportunity to describe the image, which we're seeing now on the page to the right. Yeah, I mean, it looks identical to me to the capitals that you're going to find on the National Art Museum in Philadelphia in the United States, which that example is described a couple of pages later. But it's essentially, by this point, I mean, it's done 1,000 years of mutation, right? But it's still highly recognizable with its volutes, with its palmette, and now you've got, well, of course, a more formalized set of kind of leafy details beneath, which of course are the acanthus leaves. And then now, of course, it's sort of entered into the canon. It's got this kind of classical, literally classical Greek architectural column beneath it. Yeah, I mean, the volutes are very ornate at this point. A lot more space has been given for the capital to sort of flourish and express itself, let's say. It just feels, to my eyes, as someone in this period of history, as though it's kind of, I don't want to say like it's almost like modern, yeah, right? So, because I mean, in some sense, it is in the modern period. It sort of feels very kind of like it's found itself, like it's kind of located. It's different aspects, different parts. Okay, back to the text. Immediately one recognizes the palmet in the central third eye position, and the swirling volutes which evoke the earlier palm dates in the capital of this sacred column. Clearly, a great many of these plant forms have been operational concurrently through time. Despite evidence for this, developments in the archaeological record sometimes create the impression of clean clefts between historical eras, as though there were no transition period at all. The purpose of showing this genealogy and of exploring the possible connections and divergences between cultural forms is to cautiously highlight the value of interdisciplinarity between the sciences and religion, between biology and the spiritual realm. The shift expressed here by the Greeks must also be qualified by earlier developments in the Greek canon. For example, the Doric and Ionian orders, which preceded the Corinthian, and which, when taken all together, formed the famous Corinthian order. It seems unlikely that a crystal clear distinction exists between the constituents of an eternal garden of paradise, i.e. plants and trees, and the garden of a supra-spiritual site itself. How could it, when our spiritual lives are constituted by internal experiences? I do not feel myself to be searching for God, though there have been times when I have. Tough times. Rather, I feel myself to have been searching for a deeper understanding of the architecture of power, which is perhaps inevitably, inextricably tied up with the concept of God and religion. Okay, there's still time for the subsequent image descriptions, beginning on page 100. So these are really beautiful, and I do recommend going to plural-studio.net and having a looking at some of the books, because we've got really nice photographs of the book by Fabrizio D'Alvera recently. But you can also go to the Bandcamp page where those images are represented. So the quote for this initial plate, quote, "In one tomb at Chiusi, modern-day Tuscany, dating to the 6th century BCE, there is a capital essentially identical in all its elements with the capitals discussed by us above," unquote, Ibid Shilo. This one is, it feels like it's really in stone, right? So it's quite broad, it's very condensed, it's very abstracted. This is the 6th century BCE, right? So the timeline is really fantastic. Now we're jumping 5,000 years forward to the year 500 BCE. Quote, "The group of Aeolic capitals named after the region of Aeolia in western Anatolia also includes objects essentially identical with those discussed above." Ibid Shilo. This one's amazing. I can't see how you could, I mean, oftentimes they're very intricate. I can't see how you would even carve it in stone. But there it is. It's very sort of thick 3D sort of staff head, if you like. You've got the palmette abstracted, you've got the two volutes, and you've got the leaves beneath, but it's much more of a column, like it's a column in itself. It's more like if you're holding a staff with volutes sticking out the top. It's a very beautiful idea of it in wood. The next image caption, this is circa 500 BCE again. Further removed in form and possible connections are the Ionic capitals. Unquote. Brackets, this connection is unresolved at the date of Shiloh's text in 1979, Ibid Shiloh. Note here also the dart and egg motif in the band of carved stone between the spiral volutes that echo womb-like imagery from Egyptian goddesses such as Isis and Hathor. The oval is also a symbol of the female genitalia and therefore a symbol of the female part of creation. I'm going to try and give you the last illustration, and then Chris is going to play us out for today. We have a figure. We're told in the caption that this is the Egyptian goddess Hathor bearing an oval-shaped crown. The Garden of Paradise has been a fascination of mine throughout this research. However, by focusing in on the specific motif of the sacred tree, and more specifically the sacred properties of the palm tree, I've attempted to draw certain parameters around this inquiry.